forebrain is also called prosencephalon. Prosencephalon is further divided into telencephalon and diencephalon. So telencephalon is the two cerebral hemispheres, and diencephalon consists of thalamus and hypothalamus, which we'll be learning in detail later. So today we are focusing on the telencephalon, that is the two cerebral hemispheres, and the cavity of each cerebral hemisphere is the lateral ventricle. So we have the two cerebral hemispheres which is separated by a deep longitudinal fissure, medial longitudinal fissure, and at the floor of this fissure we can see the structure that is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers which is connecting the two cerebral hemispheres, and within the medial longitudinal fissure we can see the falx cerebri. All of us have studied the attachments of falx cerebri, and the superior sagittal sinus and inferior sagittal sinus, which is seen within the falx cerebri. And at the floor of the medial longitudinal fissure we have the anterior cerebral arteries and veins. So coming to the two cerebral hemispheres, our human brain is thrown into Sulci and Gyri. That is because the total surface area of the brain is around 2200 centimeters square, but it has to be, this large surface area has to be accommodated within the rigid cranial vault. So for that we are given Sulci and Gyri. So Sulci are the fissures that we see. These can either be shallow or this can be very deep, and the Gyri are the convolutions that we see. So we have the Sulci and Gyri. Then we have to see the surfaces, the borders and the poles of the brain, of the cerebral hemisphere. So coming to the surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere, there are three surfaces. So we have, this surface is called the superolateral surface. The surface is the superolateral surface. Then we have this surface on the medial aspect. So that is the medial surface. Okay, superolateral surface, medial surface, and this surface is the inferior surface. Okay, so in one cerebral hemisphere the inferior surface is further divided into an anterior part that is called the orbital surface, and this part that is called the tendorial surface, because it is related to tendorium cerebelli. So the inferior surface is again divided into an orbital surface and a tendorial surface. So these are the surfaces. So we have superolateral surface, there is medial surface, and there is the inferior surface, again divided into an orbital and tendorial surface. Now we look at the borders. So this border, this long border, is called the supromedial border. It is in the superior aspect and it is medial. So it is supromedial border. Then we have the inferior borders. We have this border is called the infrolateral border. This border is infrolateral border, and this border is the infromedial border. So there are three. There is supromedial, infromedial, infrolateral and infromedial border. The infrolateral border can again be divided into this border that is called the superciliary border, and this border that is called infrolateral border. So infrolateral border can be divided into, this border is called superciliary border because it is related to the superciliary arch, and this border is called the infrolateral border. Then this is the infromedial border that can again be divided into three. This, here, here and here. So this border is called the medial orbital border. This border is called medial orbital border. This border is called medial occipital border. It is related to the occipital lobe, so it is medial occipital border. And this border, this curved border that we see here, here we have the crus cerebri. So it is related, it is winding around the crus cerebri. So this border is called the hippocampal border or the infromedial border. So infromedial border can again be divided into a medial orbital border, the hippocampal or infromedial border, and the medial occipital border. So the supromedial border, if you look at the supromedial border, it separates the suprolateral surface from the medial surface. This is the medial surface. Okay, so suprolateral surface from the medial surface is separated by this long supromedial border. The superciliary border separates the orbital surface on the inferior aspect from the suprolateral border surface. the orbital surface from the superolateral surface separated by the superciliary border. Then the infralateral border separates the tendorial surface from the superolateral surface. So the infralateral border separates the tendorial surface from the superolateral surface. This medial orbital border separates the orbital surface from the medial surface. Okay, so medial orbital border separates orbital surface from medial surface. This hippocampal border and the medial orbital or occipital border is separating the tendorial surface from the medial surface. So that is about the surfaces and borders. We have to hold it in anatomical position. So for that we should be able to identify which is the medial surface, which is the superolateral surface. So this is the medial surface. Medial surface consists of this cut end of the cut part of the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum is a C-shaped structure that we see in the medial surface, and it has got an anterior end and a posterior end and a body. This is the body of corpus callosum. This is the anterior end. Can you see a bend over here? So this is called genu. The anterior end is called genu, and the posterior end is more blunt and it is called splenium. So this is the splenium of corpus callosum and this is the genu of corpus callosum. So when we get a cerebral hemisphere like this, we can see this is the cerebellum. So we can clearly identify that this is the anterior end and this is the posterior end. But it need not be like this always. We need not get the cerebellar hemisphere always. So if we get simply only the cerebral hemisphere without the cerebellum, we still need to identify which is the anterior end and which is the posterior end. So that is with the help of corpus callosum. So corpus callosum, I told you, anterior end is more sharp. It is having a bend and this is called genu. This is the posterior end which is more broad and blunt. So this is the splenium of corpus callosum. So in that case, this is the anterior end of the medial surface. This is the anterior end and this is the posterior end. So coming to the poles of the cerebral hemisphere, this anterior end, this pole is called the frontal pole. This is the frontal pole. This is the occipital pole. The frontal pole is more rounded, whereas the occipital pole is more sharp, then more pointed. And then we have one more pole that is on the inferior surface. You can see this is the temporal pole. Okay, on the inferior surface, on the if you look at the superolateral surface, this the inferior aspect, this is the temporal pole. So what are the three poles? We have three poles: frontal pole, occipital pole and the temporal pole. So now we have to learn the Sulci Gyri of all the three surfaces. But before that, we have to see some important Sulci Gyri so that we can divide the cerebral hemisphere into four lobes that we know: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. So to divide this cerebral hemisphere into the four lobes, we need to learn three important sulci. That is, one sulci is called the central sulcus. It is called the central sulcus of Rolando. The central sulcus of Rolando is a sulcus that is going down along the superolateral surface. It is the only sulcus that cuts the supromedial border. So you can see there are so many sulci of this. This is the one that cuts the supromedial border. You can say it is about 1 centimeter behind the midpoint of the frontal pole and occipital pole. So you have the frontal pole and occipital pole. About 1 centimeter behind the midpoint, you have the beginning of the central sulcus of Rolando, and you can see it is cutting the supromedial border and coming down. So this is the central sulcus of Rolando. Then the next sulcus that we need to know is lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus. So lateral sulcus is beginning from the inferior aspect, from the anterior perforated substance. Okay, so this is the stem of the lateral sulcus. It is seen between the orbital and the tendorial surface, and the stem will then divide into 3 rami. So this rami is called the posterior ramus. This ramus that is going all the way along the superolateral surface, this is the posterior ramus. You can see this is the posterior ramus. So this is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus of Sylvius. Lateral sulcus of Sylvius, and this is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, and this is the central sulcus of Rolando. Then there is one more sulcus that is starting from the medial aspect. This sulcus over here, this sulcus is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. It is called the parieto-occipital sulcus. It cuts the supromedial border and it comes to the superolateral surface. It emerges in the superolateral surface, the parieto-occipital sulcus. Then when we learned about the infralateral border, there is one depression that is about 3 centimeters in front of the occipital pole. This depression is called the preoccipital notch. It is called the preoccipital notch. Now we need to draw two imaginary lines. First imaginary line is from the parieto-occipital sulcus to the preoccipital notch. You have to draw one imaginary line. So that is the first imaginary line connecting the parieto-occipital sulcus to the preoccipital notch. The first imaginary line. The second imaginary line is the backward continuation of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. This is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. Backward continuation of this to the till it joins the first imaginary line. That is the second imaginary line. So when we plot this much in the supralateral surface, we can divide the cerebral hemisphere into 4 lobes. So behind the first imaginary line that is connecting the parieto-occipital sulcus to the preoccipital notch, this lobe is called the occipital lobe. This is called the occipital lobe. Then we drew the second imaginary line like this, and we have the first imaginary line. So this area below these two lines, below the posterior ramus, the imaginary first imaginary and second imaginary line, this lobe is called the temporal lobe. Then we have learned about the central sulcus. So the area in front of, above the posterior ramus and in front of the central sulcus, this lobe is called the frontal lobe. And between the central sulcus and in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus and above the posterior ramus and above the imaginary line, we have this lobe is the parietal. So thus we have the frontal lobe in front of the central sulcus. Behind the central sulcus, we have the parietal lobe. Behind this imaginary line joining the parieto-occipital and the preoccipital notch, here we have the occipital lobe. And behind this, below the second imaginary line, this lobe is the temporal lobe. So thus we have 4 lobes for the superolateral surface. Okay, so now we have to discuss the sulci gyri in the superolateral surface. So we will discuss this lobe wise. So first we will see the sulci gyri of the frontal lobe, then the parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. So coming to the frontal lobe, so we know this is the central sulcus, cutting across the supromedial border and running along the superolateral surface. This is the central sulcus. There is one sulcus 1 centimeter in front of the central sulcus, and this sulcus is called precentral sulcus. This is called the precentral sulcus, and the gyri that is enclosed between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus is called the precentral gyrus. So that is one of the sulci in the frontal lobe. Then the remaining anterior part of the frontal lobe, we have 2 horizontal sulcus, that is the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus, thus dividing this area into 3 gyri, the superior, middle and inferior frontal gyri. So we have the superior and inferior frontal sulci, which divide the area into 3, that is superior, middle and inferior frontal gyri. The inferior frontal gyrus is further divided by the 3 rami of the lateral sulcus. So here we know the lateral sulcus starts from the inferior aspect, the anterior perforated substance. This is the stem of the lateral sulcus, and then it divides into 3 ramus. 3 rami, that is this ramus. This ramus is the anterior horizontal ramus. This is the anterior ascending ramus, and this is the posterior ramus. So this is the anterior horizontal, this is the anterior ascending, and this is the posterior ramus. So this area is again divided by that is below the anterior horizontal ramus. This is the pars orbitalis. The part between the anterior horizontal and anterior ascending, this part is pars triangularis, and the part between the anterior ascending and posterior ramus is the pars opercularis. So we have pars orbitalis, pars triangularis and pars opercularis. This is how the inferior frontal gyrus is divided by the 3 rami of the lateral sphincters. So these are the sulci gyri in the frontal lobe. Now coming to the parietal lobe. So again we have the central sulcus, and about 1 centimeter behind and parallel to the central sulcus there is a sulcus that is called post-central sulcus. So between the central sulcus and the post-central sulcus, this gyrus will be called post-central gyrus. So this is the post-central gyrus, the post-central sulcus. Then the rest of the parietal lobe is divided by a horizontal sulcus that is called the intraparietal sulcus into a superior parietal lobule and an inferior parietal lobule. So we have the superior and inferior parietal lobules by the horizontal sulcus, that is the intraparietal sulcus. Then the inferior parietal lobule can be further divided. We have the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. This is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. You can see it is upturned at this point. And so around the upturned edge of the posterior ramus, there is one gyrus, and this gyrus is called supramarginal gyrus. This is the supramarginal gyrus. Then in the temporal lobe, this transverse gyrus is called sulcus is called superior temporal sulcus, and it also has an upturned edge, and the gyrus around it is called angular gyrus. Then there is inferior temporal gyrus sulcus, and this inferior temporal sulcus also has an upturned edge, and the gyrus around it is called arcus temporo-occipitalis. So around the lateral upturned edge of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, here we have the supramarginal gyrus. Then we have around the upturned edge of the superior transverse sulcus, we have the gyrus, that is angular gyrus, and corresponding to the inferior temporal sulcus, we have the arcus temporo-occipitalis. So that is the inferior parietal lobule. We have these 3 gyrus also. So that is about the parietal lobe. Now coming to the temporal lobe, we already saw it is divided into 3 gyrus by 2 sulci. That is the superior and inferior temporal sulci, dividing it into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. This is the superior, middle and inferior temporal gyri by the 2 temporal sulcus. Of this, the superior temporal, if you look at the superior temporal gyrus, the superior surface has got an anterior part and a posterior part. So this is the anterior transverse temporal gyrus, and this is the posterior transverse temporal gyrus. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus is also called Heschel's gyrus. Okay, so that is we will learn the importance of it when we learn about the functional areas. So that is about the gyra in the temporal lobe. Then coming to the occipital lobe. So we have learned there is the parieto-occipital sulcus and the pre-occipital notch, and we have to draw an imaginary line. So this is the occipital lobe. So in the occipital lobe, there is one C-shaped sulcus that is called the lunate sulcus. That is the lunate sulcus. That is around the occipital pole. There is a C-shaped sulcus that is called the lunate sulcus. Then there is another transverse occipital sulcus which divides it into a superior and inferior gyrus, and that is the transverse occipital sulcus. And behind the parieto-occipital sulcus there is another sulcus parallel to it, behind and parallel, that is the lateral occipital sulcus. So that is the lateral occipital sulcus transversely, and lunate sulcus is the C-shaped lunate sulcus around the occipital pole. So that is about the sulci gyri in the superolateral surface. Let us have a quick revision of the sulci gyri of the superolateral surface. We have the central sulcus, and in 1 centimeter in front of the central sulcus, we have the precentral sulcus. So the gyrus is called precentral gyrus. Then we have superior and inferior frontal sulci, dividing it into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus. Then we have the lateral sulcus. We have the anterior horizontal, anterior ascending and posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, dividing into a pars orbitalis, pars triangularis and pars opercularis. Then we have in the parietal lobe, we have behind the central sulcus, 1 cm behind and parallel, we have the postcentral sulcus. This is the postcentral gyrus. We have the intraparietal sulcus dividing into superior and inferior parietal lobules. Then we have the upturned edges of the posterior ramus, the upturned edge, the gyrus surrounding it is supramarginal gyrus. The upturned edge of the superior temporal sulcus, the upturned edge is surrounded by the angular gyrus, and the inferior temporal sulcus, the upturned edge is surrounded by the arcus temporo-occipitalis. Then we have the two superior and inferior temporal sulcus dividing into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. Of this superior temporal gyrus, the superior surface has got an anterior part and posterior part. The anterior temporal gyrus is called Heschel's gyrus. Then coming to the occipital lobe, we have three important sulci. There is the C-shaped lunate sulcus, in front of the occipital pole, the transverse occipital sulcus, and the lateral occipital sulcus. So these are the three sulci in the occipital lobe. Coming to the sulci gyri of the medial surface. So the most important feature in the medial surfaces are corpus callosum. The corpus callosum has got a body. This is the genu of the corpus callosum. And can you see anteriorly there is a small extension downwards, and this is called the rostrum. So this is the rostrum, this is the genu, and this is the body of the corpus callosum. And this is the splenium, that is the broad end of the posterior end of the corpus callosum is splenium. So if you look at the rostrum if you extend it downwards, this part is called the lamina terminalis. This is the lamina terminalis, and the lamina terminalis continues as the optic chiasma. So this is our optic chiasma. So this is the lamina terminalis. Lamina terminalis represents the anterior end of the neuropore in the embryonic life. So this is the anterior end of the neuropore. So that is the lamina terminalis. This is the rhynchephalon, which contains the thalamus and hypothalamus. We'll learn the details later. So that is about the central part. Now coming to the sulci gyri. So this corpus callosum is located in this sulci. Can you see this sulcus? This sulcus is called the callosal sulcus. This is the callosal sulcus. Now above 1 cm above and parallel to this convexity of the corpus callosum, can you see another sulcus? This sulcus is called cingulate sulcus. So this is a cingulate sulcus. This is the callosal sulcus. Between the callosal sulcus and cingulate sulcus, this gyrus is called the cingulate gyrus. So this is a cingulate gyrus. So coming to the cingulate sulcus, this is a cingulate sulcus, and when it extends backwards, posteriorly it is getting upturned up to the supromedial margin behind the central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus extending up to here. This is the upper end of the central sulcus cutting the supromedial border. This cingulate sulcus extends backwards behind this part of central sulcus. So this is the cingulate sulcus, and there is one offshoot sulcus emerging from this cingulate sulcus extending upwards. So this area, so that an area is enclosed, this area is called the paracentral lobule. That is seen in and around the central sulcus. This area is called the paracentral lobule. Okay, so this paracentral lobule is the highest cortical center for defecation and micturition. That is, it controls the sphincters of urinary bladder and the anal canal. So this is the highest center of cortical center for micturition and defecation. So the paracentral lobule is important. Then the rest of the area above the cingulate sulcus is the medial frontal gyrus. This is the medial frontal gyrus. In front of the paracentral lobule, rest of the area is the medial frontal gyrus. So this is the entire thing is the medial frontal gyrus. Now this medial frontal gyrus, if you extend it downwards, that is in front of the lamina terminalis. Over here you cannot make out, but there are two gyrus over here. This gyrus just in front of the lamina terminalis is called paraterminal gyrus, and the other one is para-olfactory gyrus. In front of the lamina terminalis we have the paraterminal gyrus, and in front of that we have the para-olfactory gyrus. Then coming to the posterior aspect, here there is one sulcus. Can you see the sulcus? This sulcus that is beginning below the splenium. This sulcus that is having a convexity upwards and cutting the occipital pole. So that is the calcarine sulcus. What is it? It is the calcarine sulcus, and emerging from the midpoint of calcarine sulcus there is another sulcus that we have already discussed, that is the parieto-occipital sulcus, that is also cutting the supromedial margin and coming to the superolateral surface. So this is the calcarine sulcus coming up to here, and this is the parieto-occipital sulcus that is cutting the calcarine sulcus and coming. So this triangular area that is enclosed between the calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, this triangular area is called the cuneus. This is the cuneus, and the area in front of the or above the parieto-occipital sulcus, this quadrangular area is the precuneus. So this is the cuneus, this triangular area is the cuneus, and this quadrangular area is the precuneus. It is limited below by a sulcus over here that is called suprasplenial sulcus. This is the splenium, this is the suprasplenial sulcus. So above that, this quadrangular area is the precuneus, and this triangular area between the calcarine sulcus and parieto-occipital sulcus is the cuneus. So we have the cuneus, precuneus, this is the suprasplenial sulcus. Then we have learned this is the cingulate gyrus between the callosal sulcus and the cingulate sulcus. This is the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is continuous with the inferior surface, with the gyrus in the inferior surface through this narrow area that is called isthmus. So these are the features in the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. So to sum up, we have the corpus callosum, the rostrum, genu, body and splenium. This sulcus is called the callosal sulcus. This is the cingulate gyrus. This is the cingulate sulcus that is extending backwards. It is having an upturned end. This is the end of the central sulcus, the other end of the central sulcus. And this area surrounding the central sulcus, this area is called the paracentral lobule. The rest of the area is called medial frontal gyrus. And in front of the lamina terminalis, we have two gyrus, that is paraterminal gyrus and parolfactory gyrus. Then this is the calcarine sulcus. This convex sulcus is calcarine sulcus. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. This triangular area is cuneus. This quadrangular area is called precuneus, which is limited below by the suprasplenial sulcus. And this narrow area through which the cingulate gyrus is continuous with the inferior surface is the isthmus. Coming to the inferior surface, we have already said the inferior surface can be divided into an orbital surface. This is the anterior orbital surface, and this is the tendorial surface. This is the tendorial surface. And between the two cerebral hemispheres, this area is called the interpeduncular fossa because it is seen between the two cerebral peduncles. And the boundaries of this interpeduncular fossa is the optic chiasma anteriorly. Anterolaterally we have the optic tract. Then posterolaterally we have the crus cerebri. So here we have the crus cerebri, and posteriorly by the superior border of pons. Then coming to the contents of the interpeduncular fossa, we have learned that is the infundibulum. Then we have the tuber cinereum. Then we have the two mammillary bodies. Then we have the behind the two mammillary bodies we have the posterior perforated substance. So this is the posterior perforated substance. Then crossing the crus cerebri from medial to lateral, we have the optic tract. Then we have this artery, that is the posterior cerebral artery. Then is the posterior cerebral artery. This artery is the superior cerebellar artery, and between these two arteries we have this nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve, and further laterally coming from the dorsal aspect we have the trochlear nerve. So this is the oculomotor nerve, and from the lateral aspect we have the trochlear nerve. So these are the structures crossing the crus cerebri from medial to lateral. So that is about the interpeduncular fossa, and this we know this is the rest of the brainstem. This is the ventral surface of pons, and below we have the ventral surface of medulla. So all this we have studied before. Now coming to the inferior surface, the sulci gyri of the inferior surface. So coming to the orbital surface, this is this sulcus. Can you see the sulcus? This sulcus is called the olfactory sulcus. This is the olfactory sulcus because we have the olfactory bulb and tract is present here. So this is the olfactory sulcus, and there is one gyrus medial to it, this straight gyrus, that is called gyrus rectus. So this gyrus is called gyrus rectus. You see this H-shaped sulcus, if we can make out, this H-shaped sulcus is called orbital sulcus. This is the H-shaped orbital sulcus, which is dividing this area into four gyrus. That is, this is the medial, this is the anterior, posterior and lateral orbital gyri. So the H-shaped orbital sulcus will divide this area into 4 orbital gyrus, that is the medial, lateral, anterior and posterior orbital gyrus. So here we have the olfactory sulcus and the orbital H-shaped orbital sulcus on the orbital surface. The temporal surface. Temporal surface, there are 2 parallel sulcus, that is sulci, that are running anterior posteriorly. So this sulcus, that is in the medial aspect, this is the collateral sulcus, and there is another sulcus over here, and that is the occipitotemporal sulcus. So medially we have the collateral sulcus, laterally we have the occipitotemporal sulcus. So this is the collateral sulcus, and we have studied this is the calcarine sulcus. We have studied the calcarine sulcus. So between the collateral sulcus and the calcarine sulcus, this gyrus is called the lingual gyrus. This is the lingual gyrus. Between the calcarine sulcus and the collateral sulcus, this is the lingual gyrus. Then medial to the calcarine sulcus over here, this area, this gyrus is called parahippocampal gyrus. This is the parahippocampal gyrus. And the anterior end of parahippocampal gyrus, this area is called the uncus. This is called the uncus. And uncus is limited laterally by a sulcus, that is called rhinal sulcus. So this sulcus is called rhinal sulcus. Uncus is limited laterally by the rhinal sulcus. Medial to collateral sulcus, this is called parahippocampal gyrus. And between the collateral sulcus and the calcarine sulcus, this is the lingual gyrus. Now we have learned this one is the occipitotemporal sulcus. So between medial to it, we will see the medial occipitotemporal gyrus, and laterally we will see the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. So that is the sulci gyri and the inferior surface. So if we have to revise the orbital surface we have 2 important sulci. This sulcus is called the olfactory sulcus, and the gyrus medial to it is gyrus rectus, and this is the H-shaped orbital sulcus dividing this area into 4 orbital gyri: medial, lateral, anterior and posterior orbital gyrus. Then coming to the tendoral surface. Tendoral surface, we have learned this is the 2 parallel sulcus, that is called the collateral sulcus medially and the occipitotemporal sulcus laterally. The collateral sulcus is medial. Medial to it, this sulcus is called, this gyrus is called parahippocampal gyrus, and anteriorly this area is called uncus, which is limited laterally by the rhinal sulcus. And between the collateral sulcus and the calcarine sulcus, we have the lingual gyrus. This is the lingual gyrus. Then this is the occipitotemporal sulcus. Medial to it, we have the medial occipitotemporal gyrus, and laterally we have the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. So that is the tendoral surface. We have to learn about the types of sulci. We have learned the different names of the sulci in the different regions. Now we will learn the types of sulci. So we have one type is called the limiting sulcus. Limiting sulcus limits 2 functional areas, 2 different functional areas. So for example for that is our central sulcus, Frolando, that limits 2 functional areas. So in the anterior aspect you have the motor area, and the posterior aspect you have the sensory area. So these 2 areas are separated by the limiting sulcus, that is the central sulcus. That is the example for limiting sulcus. Then coming to axial sulcus. So axial sulcus is seen, it is seen as an axis along a functional area. So example for that is our calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus is seen along the axis of the visual functional area, the visual area. Then comes the operculated sulcus. Operculated sulcus example is the lunate sulcus. We have learned there is a C-shaped sulcus. C-shaped sulcus along the just in front of the occipital pole. This C-shaped sulcus is the lunate sulcus. Lunate sulcus is an example for operculated sulcus because the 2 lips are separating 2 different functional areas, and within the walls and floor there is another functional area. So that is why it is called operculated sulcus. Then another type of sulcus is the complete sulcus. That is actually a very deep sulcus which causes an indentation on the walls of the lateral ventricle, of the cavity of the cerebral hemisphere, that is the lateral ventricle. So example for a complete sulcus, a deep complete sulcus is, one example is calcarine sulcus, and the other example is the collateral sulcus. These causes indentations on the walls of the lateral sulcus, which we will be studying later. So that is complete sulcus. So then, other than the 4 lobes that we have studied, there is one more lobe that is said to be the 5th lobe. This lobe is called the insula or the island of Rheal. It is seen in the it is a submerged part that is seen in the floor of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. So we know this is the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. In the floor of the posterior ramus, that is, once we diverge these lips, we can see the insula. So this is the insula, and the insula is surrounded all around by a sulcus that is called the circular sulcus. So it's surrounded all around by a circular sulcus, and it is covered by 3 opercula or lids. This opercula over here is called frontal opercula. This opercula is called the frontoparietal opercula, and this is the temporal opercula, which is surrounding the insula. And there is one more lobe, that is the 6th lobe, that is the limbic lobe, which is the oldest lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. It is more well developed in reptiles and other lower animals, and in humans, because of the development of the neocortex, the limbic lobe has become submerged in the lower and the inferior and the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and we'll study about it later.